In addition to being able to extrude Illustrator shapes, you can also create models in Cinema 4D by using primitive objects. That's what we'll go ahead and do in this video. Obviously, to start, we want to make sure we're into Cinema 4D. So let's go to the project panel and make sure you have modeling.c4d selected. Then press Command C or Control E Windows to edit the original file. Let's go to our Objects Manager and you can see we have an Extrude NURBS object. This is our Plus Sport logo and it was created by extruding an Illustrator file. Let's go ahead and rename that. Double click on the name and let's call this Plus logo. With the Extrude NURBS object selected, if you go down to the Attributes panel, you can see I have a number of different things that I can change. Anytime you see boxes like this in the interface, it means you have different channels you can apply changes to. So you can see we have basic and coordinates, objects, caps and font. If you look in the coordinate section, this is what controls where the objects appears in the scene. So if I click and drag on these arrows, I can reposition the object along the X, Y and X axis accordingly. Now I'll just undo the last couple of transformations. The middle column controls your scale and the right column controls your rotation. If HPB doesn't make sense to you, you can go ahead and click on the pull down and change it to say XYZ. That way, when you're clicking and dragging, you know you're going to rotate around the Y-axis, the X-axis or the Z-axis. Alright, let's go ahead and undo those last few things and let's jump to the object channel. In here we can actually control the shape of our objects. If I click and drag on the X parameter for movement here, notice it's actually sliding the back part of our model along the X-axis. That's not what I want to do, so I'll undo. Let's click and drag on the Z parameter. This is controlling the depth of our extrusion. Now, just so I can see things a little more clearly, I'm going to press S on my keyboard to reframe the model that's been selected. With our model being extruded, I generally like to have a little more control over seeing the detail in the model. So to do that, let's go to the display options in the viewport, click on that and let's change the shading to the root shading with lights. Now I can actually see some of the different changes being applied to the model as we make these different adjustments. Let's increase the number of subdivisions. Notice each time I click a number up, it's giving me more lines down the extrusion. These lines add extra geometry to the model, and they come in really handy when you're working with polygon modeling. Now we're not going to convert this object to polygon models in this specific case, but I just want you to understand that that is a normal process in Cinema. You can convert your objects to polygons. Now let's go to the cap section. In here we can control the transition of the extrusion to the face of our model. If we go to the start area under cap, let's click on that and choose fillet cap. This will add a bevel to the edge of our model. If you increase the number of steps, you'll smooth out that transition. If you increase the radius, you'll make that rounding a little bit larger. This happens to be distorting the model in addition to making it larger. So if you go down to the bottom here and check constrain, you'll make the model actually constrained to the original boundaries of the logo. Now obviously when I did that, I want to go ahead and decrease the radius here again, so I don't have that strange distortion. Now since I have the shader active with the lines, I'm having a hard time seeing the edges of my model. So I'll go back up under display and just change it back to Garand shading. This way I can see a little more clearly what's happening. Let's create a primitive object. Let's go up to the Create tools in the upper right side of the interface. The leftmost creation tool is our primitive objects tool. If you click and hold, it'll open up the menu for the primitive objects. If you move your mouse over top of these little grippy lines, it'll rip that interface piece right out. Now I can click on those lines and dock them in between my attributes panel and my objects panel. When I let go, they'll always be in this position. Let's go ahead and add two different primitive objects. We'll add a cube and we'll add an oil tank. Now, in order to see these a little more clearly, I'm going to go ahead and click on their control handles and drag on the X-axis. And then here we can go ahead and select our cube and we can drag on that one as well. Let's start by zooming into our cube. I'm going to hold down Option on the Mac and then right click to zoom into the cube. And then still holding Option, I'll middle click and drag to reframe. Now with our cube object, we have the same kind of filler options that we had with our Extrude NURBS. They're in the object panel, and if we select fillet, notice we get the same rounding. And now with primitive objects, we have these orange control handles, If I click and drag on these handles, they'll allow me to make adjustments visually in the scene. So if I wanted to make this kind of skinny and long, like a wall, I could do that. If we look back in Attributes Manager and click and drag on the fillet radius, we can smooth out the corners or make them really tight and refined. So most primitive objects work in this manner. Let's go ahead and select our oil tank in the Objects panel and then press S on our keyboard to quickly reframe to that selected object. Notice I have the same control handles. Visually I can click and drag and make adjustments just by clicking on those individual shapes. I definitely encourage you to click through some of the different primitive objects to see if you can create something unique that's all your own. Now I'm sure in certain instances you'll want to combine more than one primitive object to create a model. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and click on my cube here and click on its x-axis to slide it back over in the scene. Notice I accidentally clicked on that control parameter to change the model. Sometimes it's hard to see exactly what you're clicking on, so if you make a change, just go ahead and press Command Z to undo. Now when I click and drag, notice I've repositioned my model in the scene. I can click on my other primitive object and just go ahead and position it up in the scene. Now since I'm working visually and I have no idea exactly how far this is going through the object, I'm going to open up multiple viewports by clicking in the corner. This way, for example, if I click on the top area here, I can see exactly how far into the cube my oil tank has gone. So I'll go ahead and just click and drag on the size of the oil tank. And notice I'm having an issue doing that on the viewports. Sometimes it just makes more sense to click and drag on the parameters in the Attributes panel. So that's what I'll do. Let's decrease the size of the radius here, and now if we decrease our model, it looks sort of like I have an antenna popping up out of the top of our box. I'm going to zoom out for a second. If I want to move this as one object, I'll click on the cube and hold down Shift and click on the oil tank. And then if we go to the Objects pull down in the Objects Attribute Manager, we can group these objects. Once we do that, it'll automatically place those objects in a null object. So here I can just call this wall pipe. With that object created, I can go ahead and reposition it in the scene as one individual element. If I click on my rotation tool, I can go ahead and rotate the object. If I click on the scale tool, I can click and drag and adjust the scale. Notice when I'm adjusting the scale, I don't have to click directly on the object. As long as it's selected, I can just click and drag. So that was your whirlwind tour of modeling different objects in Cinema 4D. As you can tell, the process just involves selecting the objects in Objects Manager and then making sure that you can adjust the attributes using the different channels in the Attributes panel. When I go ahead and save this project, I'll be updated back into my After Effects file.